Welcome to the Mary Mavis Show, the show that focuses on remarkable results and your personal power. Here is your host, Mary Mavis.
I am delighted to invite my guest today, Julian Kaufman. Julian is the CEO and president of JDK Group. He is a coach and consultant focused on executive and organization development. He works with top leaders and teams, as well as those in the middle of the organization. Prior to his private practice, he was an HR executive, human resources executive, which is where I met him 15 years ago. He hired me as an executive coach for some of his leaders at Tyco. And after that, hired me as a consultant and coach to design and conduct leadership training for a very critical middle layer of leadership at AIG. As always with Julian, we are in for a treat. He tends to have deep insights and very practical guidance about being successful in an organization. So welcome, Julian, to the show.
Thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. I only wish my mother could have been here to hear it.
So we're just going to jump right into it. And the first part of the show today is to really gain an understanding and so here's the question. When you think back to your younger, earlier career days, what do you wish you knew that you know now? So this is sort of the big insights, or at least several insights that, could bring, that you can bring, pulling the thread through your experience. And actually, one of the things that we're going to hear from Julian today is both experience as a leader, as a people manager, as well as his experience of being a coach and consultant to organizations. So I'm going to kick it off and let you just tell us sort of what are your thoughts?
In terms of what I wished I knew earlier in my career that I've learned through experience and scar tissue, I believe, Mary, we've talked about this. We all try to formulate our own unified field theory of organizations. If we've been in this field for a while, you really start to wonder, okay, what are the magic keys that make organizations effective, that make leaders effective? And I've come around to one of those unified field theories. And ultimately, what I've learned through experience is that what tends to accelerate the development of leaders, what tends to accelerate the development of teams, what tends to accelerate the development of organizations is to learn what is on everybody's mind. If you can gather that information and give it to the group or the individual as a platform for dialogue or as a platform for their further development, you really have kickstarted the process. And so that is usually my agenda in any situation, which is how can I help accelerate the discovery of this important information so that people use that as a platform for dialogue, for conversation, for problem solving. So the way I apply that now, having learned these things, is I'll do some things that I didn't used to do earlier in my career. So for instance, when I engage with an executive coaching client, one of the first things that I do, typically the first thing I do, after I've had some listening to them and what they want to tell me, is to build trust. I give them my brief on them. I let them know what I've been told by the organization about them, what I'm being commissioned to work with them on. And I will tell you more often than not, this comes as a surprise to them because no one has given them that feedback. And that they're looking to you as an executive coach to be a surrogate for that. So just in order to build trust, in order to provide that initial platform where I'm actually adding some value for them because I'm reducing their blind spot about things that are data that's already out there in the organization. The only difference is now they have it in a framework or a format where they can do something with it. So that's certainly one thing. The other thing that I do is typically when I'm working with executive teams or middle level teams, usually one of the things that we have to do is gather that data in advance for the team, in part because every organization is in time famine. Certainly as compared to 15, 20 years ago, organizations, they don't have time for week-long meetings. You're lucky if you can get a full day, right? A day and a half is downright luxurious. So I tend to jealously protect meeting time by trying to gather as much information as I can before the meeting that we have so that we can use that data as the platform for dialogue, for problem solving, and it kind of level sets everybody. And I think it tends to also reduce the anxiety some people have, like, oh, it's not just me that feels this way. They see that. And so just by sharing that summary report with the team, I used to not want to steal my thunder. I used to want to come in with the big impact and have a very impactful meeting where they look at the data and their eyes grow big as saucers and they go, oh my goodness, we have to do something about it. I have found through experience that it is better to give people a little bit of soak time. And sometimes for the people for whom the feedback is difficult, acceptance time. Right? If the problem's being pointed out. So allowing them to have that data in advance, even though it deprives me of the big moment, let's say at the start of the meeting, I'm coming in and they've already done it. So maybe it seems a little anticlimactic to them, or anticlimactic to perhaps the theatrical setting I wanted for my big reveal. It actually tends to work a lot better because they've had time to think, time to reflect. I've usually posed certain questions I'd like them to think about as they reflect on the summary report. And that tends to lead to a more productive and a much more time-efficient session, in part because they've had the acceptance time and they've had the thinking time. And so, I think as with so many things, it's not about you, it's about the client you're serving. And so it's about what serves them best.
And so let's talk about how that applies when you're inside an organization. I love this insight of learn about what's on everyone's mind, because it's so easy to approach a project or approach a meeting with what you think and what you want people to hear. And like you're saying, you want your thunder not to be, canceled out. So how did you, can you think of a time inside an organization when you were a leader where you learned that you needed to stretch out and understand how people were thinking, get to know them, or where it became a liability that you didn't know where people were?
I think we've all had experiences where you're in front of a group and you get surprised, you get a bit sort of ambushed about people's thinking on a topic, and you have to adjust on the fly. I will tell you a few things that have come about, and this sort of fits into what I wish I'd learned earlier. I think I've had this tendency to believe, I think many of us have this tendency to believe that alignment and teamwork is somehow a natural state of affairs in organizations. And what you come to learn when you do the kind of work we do through experience is teamwork and alignment are anything but natural. What is natural is separateness and turf. We're tribal animals. We tend to tribe off. We tend to reinforce any boundaries and separations that already exist. So it is an act of leadership to counter that drift towards separateness and turf. And it takes often maniacal daily pull from leadership to pull people in the direction of alignment, teamwork, taking coordinated enterprise-wide action, being in relationship with one another. Because what you learn, and what sometimes used to surprise me to your question, is that you'd find out that people had a lot of we-they stereotyping. Right. Headquarters versus the field, this function versus that function, commercial versus supply chain, et cetera, all those kinds of tensions that exist in organizations. And there's a lot of their problem is not my problem. And you have to sort of expect that and accept it and then redirect it. And leaders often have to be coached to understand that on a day-to-day basis, they're going to have to apply energy to counter this almost entropy-like drift towards separateness and turf. And I'd say that's one thing. I'd say the other thing that I've found in terms of where I was surprised or where I've had to make adjustments and, you have to blow up your plan. I frequently come in with a plan for a day and a half, let's say, or a 2-day meeting, which I was going to guide people through. And I have an architecture for those kinds of meetings that I trust and that I've used and been successful with. What I've found increasingly, particularly because I'm usually working with people who are extremely results-oriented and outcome-focused, is that if they don't feel like they're aligned on their priorities, if they don't feel like they're getting some traction on their priorities, their anxiety level is going to grow throughout the meeting. And I have often had to shelve the second day or the second half day of my agenda with people in order to allow them to work on their priorities and feel some sense of accomplishment. So I've had to learn flexibility in that regard. I know I probably tend to be more process oriented. I'm about their relationships, their interactions, how they work, their ways of working together. They are much more focused on their outcomes. And I often have to end up allocating time in the meeting to allow them to focus on making progress on those things.
And in order to do that, you have to be present to what's going on in the meeting, right?
Yes. Yes.
So you have to be both paying attention to what's the agenda. And I want to sort of broaden this as it's not just about a consultant or a coach or a team leader. It's about anybody who has an agenda on a meeting, a topic on a meeting agenda that has to really think about, what do you want to present? What are you trying to accomplish? And then be in the moment.
Yes.
Really be present to what's happening. And one of the things you've said to me, Julian, in the past is that objections mean people care.
Yes. It's a sign of interest.
It's a sign of interest.
Yeah.
And what we often do is we defend against those objections, right?
Yeah.
Because we've got our agenda. I know I am definitely, particularly where I'm an expert, I get hooked all the time with my idea, my driving force. Let me explain it one more time. And yet, if you step back and think about what am I hearing in this group, what's on the table right now, you can actually be a participant in a meeting and add a lot of value by paying attention to what's happening in the meeting and redirecting the agenda or the consultant.
Absolutely.
I've had clients who have said, I know we were planning to do this, but it seems to me everyone has a lot of energy for this, and let's keep it going. And I have to take my driver out and out of the way. And as you say, pay attention to what the client is really wanting to do.
Indeed. And I think it's happening more and more and more frequently.
And the time sensitivity is huge.
Yes.
I don't know about you, you're probably better at it than I am, but I think it's very common that we've planned way too much for the meetings that we've scheduled. So
16 pounds of sugar in an 8-pound bag.
You could never get it done. And so when I plan it, I assume that I've planned a little bit too much, and I know what I'm going to cut out and where I'm going to zig and where I'm going to zag. And I think it's often for young leaders, it's their shining spot, right? It's their project or their part of the presentation. And it's very easy to get disappointed when someone in the meeting slows things down.
Right. And as I often give people sort of almost explicit permission, or frankly, explicit permission to adjust the agenda by saying, agendas are exercises in false precision, right? Yes, we have these time allocations set. And, there's a quote that gets attributed to Mike Tyson, which actually is George Foreman's quote. And that is, everyone has a plan until they get hit. Right. And every facilitator, every coach, we have a plan until we get hit. And it's about being able to pivot and adapt and serve the client. It's not about us.
Yeah. So, I want to go back to your point about getting to know what everyone is thinking,
Yes.
because, and it ties into this whole time famine. My young clients often don't know how they could possibly get to know each person, particularly now when we're virtual. So if you say, well, walk by somebody's office, poke your head in, say, do you have a minute, or make a coffee date, you really can't do that in the same way now. So, how does someone actually get to know a person in the current state? Let's talk about that, because you're invited into a client. I'm invited into a client. One of the first things we do, if it's a coaching thing, is we do interviews. So that's what you're saying, is you're collecting that data and you're distilling it and you're organizing it. But if you really need to understand the key stakeholders, or in my book, I call them co-creators, the people who really matter to your result, how do you do that?
Well, I'll give you a recent example. And I don't know if this is something where I have this luxury in every client, but recently I had to do an organization redesign for a major healthcare company who were launching a new product. And in order to launch this new product, we had to do a significant organization redesign of one of their major functional organizations. And there are hundreds and hundreds of people spread out across the world in this organization. And I asked, first off, I said, before I'm called upon to facilitate meetings, before I'm called upon to really add value, I'd love to just sit in on a couple of meetings to be introduced to the group. I'm there to listen. I can offer some, perhaps process suggestions or conceptual inputs for people to consider. But by and large, I'm just soaking in, as you would put it, the context. Right. They're in charge of the content, but it's also about the context. And so that I had great success there, because I was able to sit in on a few meetings and get people used to having me around before I was actually in charge of what the participants would be doing. This is actually an interesting case study, coming back to things I wished I learned earlier in my career in terms of what we did here. One of the unified field theories that I've developed is, do not expect people who have never operated in an integrated manner to value being integrated. Just like alignment and teamwork aren't natural, right? They require acts of leadership pull daily, maniacally, to keep people in alignment, in coordination, in relationship, having enterprise-wide thinking. This was a scenario where people had not operated in an integrated fashion. You had very separate functional organizations nested in the businesses and nested in the regions of the world. And in order to achieve efficiencies, we were going to try to put those organizations together. And when you put those organizations together, you expect some net reduction in headcount because the activities are less fragmented. Well, most of the resources were in the regional organizations. And you sometimes have to give people that acceptance time. As much as you want them to get there all in one go, like that, like they turn the corner. This was one where clearly the regional organizations were going to have to give up resources to the organizations in the business units to make this work. Initially, in the first meetings, when this concept of how we would organize was put out there and the implications of it, the regional organizations were highly resistant, particularly, to no one's surprise, in Europe, Middle East, Africa, et cetera. And so over the course of meetings, asking people to come up with certain ways to address the scenario, asking them to come back with proposals. You and I have talked about change management. The change management is more effective when we understand that people don't resist change per se, they resist how they get changed. And if they feel the change is somehow elective on their part, a choice they're making, as opposed to imposed upon them, it's going to be more successful. So by asking the somewhat balky people who were responsible for the regional organizations to put their heads together and come back with proposed ways to do this, and to take on things like, how would you do it if you were doing it with 10%, 20% less resources than you have today? We got them around to where they were the ones proposing the idea. But again, it comes back to, you can't expect people who've never operated in an integrated fashion to immediately value being integrated. It's not something people grasp intellectually. It's only something that people typically grasp experientially. When you've lived and worked in a truly integrated, connected, coordinated, collaborative structure, you want that again. But if you haven't, or you've grown comfortable with a structure that isn't that way, don't expect people to value it and cotton to it immediately.
Right.
And so I would say using multiple meetings to get to know people, to get them comfortable with the issue, increasingly, especially if you're making complex change in organizations, you're not going to have one and done meetings where it's over, where you've got the grand magic aspirin for your problem.
So what you're saying is that I resonate a lot with is to step back and intentionally think about where and do the spade work to figure out before you begin, where is everybody? So if whether you're an external consultant or whether you're an internal leader or a project or initiative leader, what you're saying is step back and think about, what do you know and what do you not know? And go do a little spade work. And when you bring people together, it sounds like the work was to get them to talk to each other.
Yes, it was. It was. And to sort of bring them around to what the sponsor wanted, which was a unified, integrated, more efficient organization.
Yeah.
But they had to own it. They had to feel it was their idea.
And so in that case, if you were an internal leader, you would have to be very intentional about taking that approach. You would have to think about who can be supportive in the meeting. How do you break up the meetings, right? But most importantly, you got to get away from your PowerPoint slide deck.
Yes. Because that's not where the real interaction and problem solving and decision making takes place.
And that's the hardest part, right? I think. It even so it is with me when I'm doing some event. I get very focused on the document and have to really step back and think intentionally, what do I want the outcome to be from this particular meeting? And how does that tie into the ultimate outcome? And then really design the meeting. And I think that's one of the strongest things I recommend to team leaders or department managers is you have to design your meeting.
Yes.
You have to design it for the interaction of the people. You have to design it knowing who the people are, what their personalities are, who will take over,
right?
Who's not going to speak up.
Mm-hmm. And in designing the meetings, one of the things that I recognized was, as an external person, you have very limited time. If you're an internal person,
right,
there tends to be more patience. There tends to be an iterative approach, and we're going to do it as a series of conversations. So it was quite strategic to just sit in on the meetings and assimilate and become part of the background and the fabric of that organization, so that when I did introduce things, they thought, oh, this actually is going to take a bit more time than just this 3-hour block that we have.
Right.
We need to do this. We're going to need to go off as a separate sub-team and work on it, which is exactly what they did and got a good result.
Right. Yeah. So, let's see, where are we? I want to go back to the whole idea of getting alignment, which is such a talked about objective. What we need to do is get alignment. Mm-hmm. And you're saying it's not natural to bring yourself into alignment. It's very natural if I agree to get in alignment with something. But if I don't agree intellectually, and particularly if I'm an expert, I'm not necessarily just going to join into alignment. So what do you do when I mean, we've talked about your client engagement. So what do you do when they didn't get into alignment? What are the strategies?
Sure. So part of it is activating the leadership and the sponsorship of the project to be able to supply some of that. Because while they can hear certain things from me, it has a very different resonance and impact when they hear it from their leadership. So part of the thing we did in terms of getting to alignment, and this really are two generalized principles. Firstly, we tend to grossly under-leverage the power of vision. Right? So getting leadership to talk about the vision of, and to enroll people's senses of what it could look like, what better would look like, to enroll people and to actually help parameterize that for people and to not be so sort of cautious about saying what leadership's expectations are, the size of the organization, but also understanding what it'll look like, understanding what the experience of it would be like, what it would feel like to work in that organization. What kinds of things would we hear said about us by different stakeholders? Those kinds of things there. The other thing that I think is related to vision, which organizations tend to under-leverage, usually by a factor of 10, is the power of overarching superordinate goals that everybody has a stake in, that everybody that everybody's measuring. And we don't often reinforce that as the shared interest, as the common goal. And that unity of purpose is something that tends to get people better, more willing to contribute and more willing to seek ways of getting into alignment with one another. So again, the use of superordinate goals and keeping those front and center, and then painting a vision for people. It's kind of like a magnet that's pulling them forward into the future. And you can tell them all about the problems. You can tell them all about what needs to get fixed and what we're trying to move away from. That's like kicking a wedge underneath a ball to get it rolling. But you need that magnet of vision pulling that ball forward into the future. And so I'd say those were the two key things that I activated sponsors to help with, to remind people of the overarching goals and to help people understand, these factors. Yeah.
And alignment isn't reality just because people are nodding their heads.
Correct.
Or they voted. I love we took a vote and we asked everybody after 4 hours whether they were in agreement or not.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, 2 days later, we found out that there wasn't really alignment. And so if you think about what alignment is this sort of agreement, either agreement in full or an agreement to be on board.
Yep.
Might be alignment. It's really important to think about what are you saying that is, because I've had people aligned with me who still didn't agree, but they got aligned.
Yeah. And to me, the thing that I most want to test people's alignment on or pressure test it is an action plan, what they're going to do when they leave. And so at the end of action planning, and by the way, one of the things I've learned is action planning needs more time than most other activities, in part because people enjoy identifying and polishing problems. They enjoy coming up with vision. They enjoy telling you about the barriers to achieving that vision. They enjoy ideating and coming up with potential things we could do. But when it comes time to do action planning and we're deciding who is actually going to do what by when, we're actually talking about loading additional tasking onto already full plates. And that is something that people have less energy for. So you have to allow a bit more time, take some breaks in between, recognize that there's going to be an energy drain a bit during that period. When you're done with the action planning, the thing that I've learned to do is to secure commitment, to come back to this notion of, you know, are you really with it? And so I'll ask a question like, on a scale of 1 to 10, not are you committed, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how committed are you to implementing this action plan we've come up with? 10, right. I'm completely committed. 1, thanks, but I'd rather file my nails in the Cuisinart, right? And if anybody says anything less than 10, I'll ask what is standing in the way of you getting to 10, and what can the team do to get you closer to 10, right? And that usually brings about, you know, I live by many mottos, and one of them is not all manipulation is unethical, right? And sometimes when you ask them, what can the team do to bring you toward a 10, it creates some positive peer pressure on people to say, here's what you can do, rather than I'm an immovable object, I can't be moved closer to a higher level of commitment. It's like I'm asking your team what the teammates can do.
So, Julian, if we go back and pull the thread through this conversation, if you start with strong intention for what you want to create, and then really strive to understand what everybody's thinking, where are they on it? Recognizing that it's not natural to, you know, gravitate toward alignment or gravitate toward teaming. And you got to get your own wanting to be center stage out of the way and really put yourself in the presence, be present with people that you're working with and pay attention to what's happening so that you can bring alignment through the shared conversation. It sounds like what you're doing with your clients.
Absolutely. And you know,
and you would do that if you were a team leader within the organization, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, as you and I have previously talked about, getting comfortable asking questions and remaining silent, right? And allowing other people to become more uncomfortable with the silence than you is a very valuable leadership quality. And when you get inputs, if you can reflect back to them some kind of empathetic statement that signals to them that you've not only heard the content of what they've said, but you understand the feelings or the emotions underlying their input, that makes them feel, oh, wow, I've been really understood. And people often won't get down to solving problems until they feel their feelings have been understood. So empathy, inquiry, and patient listening is are really critical leadership skills, as you and I have talked about for years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Julian, you know that chapter number 2 is called People Are Funny.
Yes.
How are you funny? Funny to work for?
I've had to reflect a lot about my own style as a boss. And one of the things that I've learned from people, sometimes through painful feedback, is that my involvement with people who report to me, particularly on projects, looks like an upside down bell curve. You know, there's a high involvement at the start, shaping things, framing the opportunity, sort of clarifying what the priorities are. Then, in part because I'm practicing the fallacy of the golden rule, right, which is doing unto others the way we want to be done unto, I want to be given tremendous professional freedom. And at this point in my career, I want that freedom, right? I'm given freedom to do things. I tend to give people a lot of space and freedom, and I tell them, manage my involvement in your world. I've learned that I probably need to reinforce that at various points because people are sometimes a bit hesitant to come back to you for direction or redirection or with questions. At the end, I swoop in after they've struggled with something, perhaps needlessly, where I perhaps could have added more value and they've gone through a lot of toil. At the end, I tend to swoop in with a heavy involvement in terms of packaging, editing, merchandising. You know, some people might consider this excessive excessively anal and granular, but looking at font sizes, looking at colors, looking at layout, looking at italicizing and bolding things, all those kinds of packaging and merchandising, which often are the form through which the substance gets valued. But that can be a bit jarring for people who've seen me, perhaps in their mind, abdicate from the project for a while, and in the meantime left them to struggle.
You'd be my worst nightmare with the detail. You know that. Mm-hmm. Because you used to put red pen to my documents when I was working with you to make a proposal to senior leadership, which is fine. I need the help. So what happens for people? Do they get in trouble because they don't realize that they need to stay in touch with you or reach out to you?
Well, I generally tell people, look, I'm never going to be upset with you for taking initiative. I'm never going to be upset that you took efforts to try to solve problems on your own or made decisions. What I'll get upset about is where I could have added some value, where I could have added some perspective, some counsel, for you, and I wasn't utilized. One of the first things that you told me when we had a coaching session was bosses want to find themselves well used, right? And I certainly wanted to find myself perhaps better used. And so, in terms of how I would advise somebody who works for me is I would advise them to set up more regular checkpoints. And in fact, I will and have advised them subsequently to set up regular checkpoints with me, even if they don't feel they need it or I don't feel they need it, even if it makes them perhaps feel like they're being supervised a bit. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I have to recognize that people need more structure than I need, and we tend to do unto others the way we want to be done unto. And just because I want to be macro-managed doesn't necessarily mean I should macromanage somebody who isn't all that task mature, who may be taking on a project of this sort for the first cycle they've ever done it, and I have multiple cycles.
And some of the young leaders that I'm working with now, I can think of two people in this situation where maybe it's not what you're talking about, but there's a hesitancy to look like they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
Like, to not know, to reach out and say, I'm not sure I'm on track. Yep. Or I need to learn how to do this, and can you check it through for me? Mm-hmm. And what I think it really takes is the confidence to ask for help or to ask for a checkpoint or to know for yourself that your tendency would be to run with the authority, but you don't really know Julian yet. He's a new manager for you, and you get stuck on your own by just not raising your head up. Mm-hmm.
People are so willing, so eager to say, I've got this. Let me handle this. Let me show you I can run. Let me show you what I can do. And to counter that, to your point, I've said to people, look, you have to be confident enough to ask for help.
Yes.
Be confident enough to admit ignorance and say, I don't know, but I'm going to try to find out. As you and I have talked about, confidence is the belief that the application of your effort will produce results, which is why the confident people, confident teams do the work. They do the work because they believe the application of their effort will produce results. However, in some cases, doing the work means asking for help. Doing the work means admitting ignorance and seeking out expertise, right? As opposed to trying to handle it all yourself, which often leads to failure because, usually if we're dealing with complex problems, they are inherently multifunctional, right? And you're usually having to touch and interact with people who are at the boundary or across boundaries of your team and organization. So,
and what's funny, Julian, is that I think that bosses, particularly senior people, and or a personality style. So I would say you're a tough person to meet your expectations. You have very high expectations about the work that needs to be done. And so you may not know how intimidating you are. We forget it. Or if you're like me, you say, well, why would anybody be intimidated by me? I'm just Mary Mavis.
Right. When you
Good old Mary Mavis.
Right. When you wake up in the morning, you look in the mirror, it's just you there. You don't see what they see.
Exactly.
They see le grand fromage. They see the big cheese. They see somebody who, if they get a kind word from that person, they might be walking several inches off the ground for a few days.
That's right.
If they get a tough word from that person, they're in the pits for a few days.
But they don't also don't realize that they can raise their hand, they can raise their voice and ask. And in most cases, if they do that with confidence and purpose, they'll be very surprised in a positive way. Not with everyone, but with most people.
Indeed.
And
the fact is, most bosses feel overburdened. Most bosses feel overwhelmed with responsibility.
Everybody feels overburdened.
And so it's a natural response. It's a natural response to that, seeing that, to want to take things off the boss's plate, wanting to sort of unburden them from their responsibilities.
Correct.
But where I see most delegation fail is that the boss, including myself, hasn't thought enough about how do I support this person's success and how do I monitor this person's progress.
Right.
A lot of delegation fails because of the failure to follow up properly. If you're delegating responsibility, you're still accountable for the outcome. It's somebody who's in your organization. But I would urge bosses who are delegating to people to think about, how do I support this person's success and how do I monitor their progress so that if they're getting off track, we can make corrections. That, to me, is one of the big learnings about delegation. That is the difference between delegating and dumping.
And the flip side of that is, don't make assumptions that your manager or the senior person who you don't know very well, and maybe even scares you a bit, that they wouldn't have time for you.
Yep.
I learned that the hard way in consulting when I wasn't willing to reach out to a partner. And when I finally did, in desperation, the person said, why didn't you call me? Well, you're traveling, you're this, you're that, and said, I always have time.
Right. It's sort of the reciprocal of the thing you get when you do executive assessments, which is, I wished I'd had this feedback years ago, right?
Well, that's wonderful. You are a funny person. You are a funny person. And so aren't we all? And if we can share about how we're funny, we can help others be successful with us. Let's go to the final part of the show, and that has to do with what's your personal power. So this is not authority power. This is your unique contribution, things that you know, that you do, that help you be successful in whatever environment you're in. So, Julian, what's your personal power?
Thanks for asking. It's one of my favorite questions to ask people, actually, is what is your superpower?
Right.
And you'll find some interesting things. I mean, for me, in the work that I do, which is so often about gathering information, feeding it back, and facilitating action planning based on that information.
Right.
What I believe I'm able to do particularly well is to create psychological safety and comfort for people to open up and give me candid data. And some of the ways in which I do that are usually I will give them promises about anonymity and confidentiality, that no one will be cited as the source of any of the inputs. There'll be no attributions made about who said what. I'll usually get them started out with some kind of warm-up question. If I'm doing an executive assessment, for instance, we first start start talking about the person's strengths, because then the individual feels they've been charitable to the person. So now they can open up and be somewhat critical when discussing that person's development needs. I'll usually have some kind of a softball question if I'm doing more of an organization assessment, something dealing perhaps with their vision of what the organization could become, right? And just to get them connected to it before we start getting at things that are more problematic and the barriers that stand in the way of the organization. So, when I get responses from people as I'm eliciting this, part of the way I keep creating that psychological safety and comfort to keep this flowing is by responding with empathy to what they say and trying to come up with some. I collect a lot of pithy aphorisms to suit different situations. So I will often, in listening to people, I'll try to feedback saying like, wow, that's probably got to make you feel like virtue is its own punishment, right? Mm-hmm. Or that must be very annoying for you. Right. Or that's got to feel like a no-win situation, because then people feel like, oh, he's really getting me. Right. The superpower that follows that, I believe, the personal power, is the ability to synthesize, organize, reduce, and package that data in ways that get people to accept the data and to act on the data. And so you've got to, clients are looking for two fundamental things. They're looking for structure and they're looking for support. And I don't care whether you're an internal HR leader or an external consultant, or a manager. People want structure and they want support. So by organizing the data in a structure and sort of grouping it into key themes and highlighting it gives people an ability to focus their energy and attention, right? And that helps people say, I have 55 different comments, but it really groups into these 4 themes. So it seems simpler. It seems more soluble as a problem, as opposed to this, what do I do with all of this? How do I make sense of it? So part of it is just making sense of it. And then to follow that on, after you've packaged the data, after you've organized it in a way that gets them to see it as more simple and more actionable than perhaps the initial raw data looked, I then try to facilitate people in a way that is firstly very task-oriented, because when you're getting into a team setting, let's say, and you're trying to get to action planning or decision-making, they're paying you to achieve a result, and generally within an efficient period of time. So I tend to be pretty strongly task-oriented in terms of driving the discussion. And I do that through inquiry, right? In terms of I'm controlling the action through questions and eliciting more input. And if I'm not hearing it, I'll rephrase the question. I'll ask it in a different way to trigger more thinking, et cetera. And I will be comfortable, as we said earlier, with the silence more so than they. And if I have to, I'll ask another question, but I'm not going to chew their food for them. I'm not going to solve the problem for them, because they've got to own it. Right. It is a failure mode for them to say, well, the consultant suggested we do this, right? It's got to ultimately come from them. So it's really about being in charge of the questions. And then, I try to capture inputs. Fortunately, I'm a good scribe. And sometimes people say, wow, you wrote that better than I said it. And so sometimes in paraphrasing what they say, maybe I'm adding some value. So those are my sort of go-to personal powers typically.
And, one of the big distinctions with this personal power is you can be, I have the skills to synthesize data and package it and organize it and simplify it. But I wouldn't say it was my personal power. It doesn't come as naturally. So that's a place where, and I resonate with that around if you think back about talking about how you, one of the challenges is that, at the end of a project, you're very focused on the editing and all of that. I think that can often be a missed opportunity for people who are analytical. And it's not just that they can do it, that it's a way that they create specialness.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice way to put it.
It's a naturalness.
Mm-hmm.
It's the go-to.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only effective, but it's also your go-to.
Yeah.
You can do it on the back of an envelope.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you combine that particularly with inquiry, that's very powerful.
Indeed. By the way, it's anything but natural for me to organize and reduce the data. That is something that, even though I've got many cycles of learning, it's still learned behavior. It's still real effort for me to do that. But I know that clients need it, so I do it. And with regard to what you just said about the packaging of things and sort of the editing, et cetera, I'm often thinking about that with the client. Part of it that I've learned over the years is to put together a communication plan to go along with the action plan. Right. Because people know you've been in this meeting. Your team has been in this meeting. So what are you going to tell people about what you talked about, what you decided, what they can expect to see being different as a result? And just that little bit of time spent with a team to package and communicate their output, to think through some of the more political considerations, right, of how do we get people to buy into this? How do we, what are our stakeholders' care-abouts, and how do we address those care-abouts in the way we put forward our recommendation? That's value added as a consultant.
So whether it's natural or not, it's intentional.
Absolutely. Yes.
And powerful.
Yes. And by the way, I think intentionality is really the key to a lot of the work we do in executive coaching. It's really about helping people to do things not out of reflex or their developed people skills or instincts, but really understanding why they're doing what they're doing, why it works, right? And helping them to be, because that to me is the biggest differentiator between executives who reach their full potential and those who fall short, is the intentionality, doing things on purpose. And that's often why for a team or for an individual, I'll give them some conceptual framework to build their conceptual understanding to go along with a more realistic, very technique-oriented behavioral understanding of so what and now what? What do I do with it? Right. But you give them the concept of the framework to help them understand, oh, that's the bigger picture of why I want to do this. And I find that combination of conceptual and practical technique-oriented understanding to be a really winning combination for clients.
That's wonderful. So, Julian, thank you so much today for your wisdom, your insights, and all of the sharing that you've done about your own leadership and your approach to the work that you do. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this exciting podcast, and I hope other people who see it will read your terrific book.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Today's show was produced by Eric Aubrey. Our theme music was written and produced by Eric Aubrey and Tim McKinstry. The show's graphics were designed by Devin Marciano. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on Google, Apple, or Spotify. You can also find episodes at maviscompany.com, where I invite you to sign up for my weekly newsletter. I hope you use some nugget to help you create remarkable results in your world. Thank you for listening.